another piece about where life did not go according to my plans. One morning several years ago, at the end of a long winter, I answered the phone and found I had to switch the receiver over to my right ear. My left felt plugged up as if I were on a plane. Weeks and then months went by while I waited for things to return to normal, but they never did. So eventually, I made an appointment with an ENT, an ear, nose, and throat specialist, who gave me a hearing test. Sitting in a soundproof glass booth, I raised my hands in response to a series of beeping tones, but there were long periods of silence as I struggled to hear those faint beeps. The irony of all this wasn't lost on me. I earned my undergraduate degree in deaf education. I'd worked as a teacher of deaf children, and then later as a sign language interpreter. Growing up, I felt a deep connection with my Uncle Jerry, who was deaf from birth. Now I realize it was because we were both different. My uncle visibly, while I felt like an outsider on the inside. Growing up gay, I carried secrets, but unlike my uncle, I could almost pass for normal. As a boy, I looked up to Jerry, who was full of stories about his experiences as the only deaf kid on the Cleveland Heights High School basketball team. But at home, Jerry's father, my grandfather, talked to my uncle as if he were a boy. He was a 40-year-old man. My grandfather would say, "How many times have I told you? I've been over all this before. Why do I have to explain everything to you over and over again?" Sometime later, I realized that Jerry probably did miss a lot of what my grandfather said. My grandfather wore a mustache, which would make lip reading almost impossible. I realized, too, my grandfather's frustration in having a handicapped son who could never be the normal boy or man that Papa really wanted. When I was a senior in high school, I visited a school for deaf children and decided that I wanted to become a teacher. For the first time, I saw these deaf kids signing, little boys and girls, their fingers flying much too fast for me to follow. I was transfixed by their visual dance. I wanted to learn their secret language, me who was drawn to secrets. But I never saw Jerry sign. By that time, Jerry was married to his second wife, a volatile, dark-haired hearing woman, who looked a lot like his first deaf wife. But even with his first wife, Jerry didn't sign. He used his voice instead, sometimes holding his hands, restraining himself from signing, as his hearing teachers had done years earlier. Those teachers, those oral method teachers, had taught my uncle that sign language wasn't a language, but a series of crass animal-like gestures unfit for human consumption. So Jerry used his voice instead, but his speech was harsh and dissonant. When I was growing up, Jerry worked as a draftman's assistant, limited by the education he'd received from those teachers who taught my uncle to speak but little else. I'm not sure if I told my uncle of my plans to teach deaf children, but a few months later, about a month before I graduated from high school, Jerry had a heart attack and died at 44. So that day in the specialist's office, I looked across at my audiogram and knew something was seriously wrong. The doctor didn't seem too concerned. Dr. Blasé, as I thought of him, said he thought I might have had an inner ear virus. If I'd come in sooner, he would have given me steroids, but now it was too late. He said, "Come back in a year and I'll fit you with a hearing aid." I walked out of his office feeling dizzy, ungrounded. I went to a second doctor. That doctor said that he thought that one of the tiny bones in my middle ear had stopped working for some reason. Surgery might ease the problem, though I'd never have normal hearing. I chose the least invasive option, a hearing aid. I realized that I was fundamentally different than I'd been just a year before. I made frequent visits to an audiologist, a honey-voiced southern blonde, who fit me with one hearing aid, and then another, and then a third. The first two fit in my ear and were almost invisible, but in crowded spaces they would wail, which frustrated and embarrassed me. Finally, I gave in and got a behind-the-ear hearing aid, which with a visible coil, a symbol of the aging process. Still, it takes getting used to. I remove it in the rain, the wind, at the gym. As the audiologist said to me on one visit, not a day will go by when you don't think about your hearing for the rest of your life. It turns out she was right. I worry about batteries, earwax, and losing the aid on a daily basis. I go to movies, sit in crowded restaurants, and strain to catch what I can't quite hear. And I think of my Uncle Jerry. When, as a boy who couldn't fit in, I watched my uncle try to satisfy my grandfather, try to be normal, try to be like a hearing person, but he couldn't do it any more than I could become straight or turn off my fantasies of the high school jocks. Jerry was my uncle, and his deafness was part of him, like his funny speech and his big hands and his long fingers that lifted me up when I was a small boy and squeezed me a bit too hard as if to convey the connection between us, which was unspoken because I was just a boy and my uncle couldn't express his feelings through the strange puzzle of English. I remember one night in the fall of 1974 when my brother Alex had his bar mitzvah, and then that night a bar mitzvah party complete with a band and a banquet and everything. I knew that Jerry loved to dance. He could feel the rhythm pulse through his size 13 shoes. On this night, as he guided his second wife to the dance floor, Jerry was radiant. They moved to the dance floor, hips rocking side to side. My uncle was spinning out and getting down. And as the band broke into Aretha Franklin's R.E.S.P.E.C.T., taking care of TCB, my uncle was with that singer, getting down, rocking out, and no one could tell him that he was not whole, not full, not right for this one night. 6 months later, he was dead. Today, I think of my uncle and the echoes that continue between my life and his, which continue today, 35 years after his death. Thank you.